Okay. Okay. I got to checking around. I'm a little bit behind, and we got a couple minutes before we start yet. Here are some things that I realized that I had not gone over. So be sure you get this. Today's Indians can hunt and fish without a license. And if you're over 65 in Georgia, you can get a fishing license. I got one 5 years ago and haven't used it. Too time consuming. Hunting the same way. My dad liked to hunt. Panic of 1819, it was like the Depression in the 30s and like the famine that killed so many Russians and Chinese. In the famine that killed the Russians and Chinese, there was a lot of food around, but it never got the people who needed it. In the case of the Panic of 1819, there were a lot of goods around for sale, but the money wasn't there. First college to admit women, Oberlin is in Ohio. American Colonization Society wanted to send slaves back to Africa. The problem was none of the Africans wanted to go, or few of the Africans really wanted to go. All right. My watch is 4 o'clock now, so but again, does anybody have any questions, comments? Okay, we'll start. I don't know where I left off, but anyway, the very earliest factories folk were spinning mills, and the idea was they'd take yarn and or wool or cotton. Maybe you have, pardon me, take either cotton or wool or any other material that would make yarn and then spin it into yarn. But they could do it several strands at once, whereas a spinning wheel can only get one strand at a time, or a few of these could get hundreds of strands at once. Again, they used large machines, and this was the beginning of the factory. And if you ever see the inside of a factory, and most of you probably never will, the factory usually has large machines in them and plenty of them. The Erie Canal joined Albany to Buffalo and linked the Great Lakes. Canal building was stopped, though, with the invention of railroads. In the 1830s, railroads came to use. The rail could go from, the rail could be used even in the wintertime when the roads iced over. Now, the one thing that would stop a rail was several feet of snow. And while we're burning up under the tremendous amount of heat, out in northwest are having 4 feet or more of snow, and it's caught everyone by surprise. And it's setting records for cold. But the 4 feet of snow would even stop a train. All right. The hiring of young girls was called the Waltham system. The idea was they'd hire girls and pay them the very minimum wage. If the girls decided that they wanted more, they'd simply fire them and hire more girls. When the women got married, they would leave. When the women formed unions and went on strike, they were replaced. The early attempts to form unions were very ineffective. Now, gradually, the unions were to find ways to get more. Strikes were considered illegal at the time, and factory owners had the right to hire strikers. Now, today's factories are severely restricted. They cannot hire strike breakers. And they cannot threaten to move the factory. In other words, they're limited in what they can do in their fights with workers, and workers have a lot more leeway than they had 180 years ago. All right. Panic of 1819, first sharp downturn in U.S. history, and it's the only sharp downturn we had where the president was not to blame. Essentially, the Panic of 1819 affected both England and the United States. The price of cotton went down, and inflation set in and prices went higher and higher for the same goods. Then there was a dwindling money supply. Demand for Americans' goods dropped when Europe had a financial crisis. This was one of the first economic downturns in world history where when one nation's economy went down, the rest of the world's economy went down with it. The president was not expected to get involved, was not expected to give out handouts to try to ease the economic downturn. That idea was to come later. A lot of people lost their savings, lost their property. They mortgaged their houses. And when they didn't have the money to pay, the banks took their houses. Most states now allowed, but by 1828, most states allowed every white man to vote. Now I have to say white man because that's the way it was. Again, human beings have never been what they should be. And you have to at some point come to terms with what human beings are, because that's the way life sometimes is. If you keep trying to imagine that you're what they should be, you're going to wind up going completely nuts. But anyway, they had parties on behalf of the candidates. Parties, most of the time a whole lot of hard drink was served. Andrew Jackson got the name Old Hickory. If you know anything about wood, hickory is a very strong wood. The hickory nut, mostly hard shell and very little nut in between it, but nevertheless, I've always liked cracking hickory nuts myself. I once had a hickory nut tree in my front yard, but it died. But anyway, there were two groups. They both claimed to be the same party. Clay's group called themselves the National Republicans. Jackson called themselves the Democrats Republicans. Both of them claimed that they were successors to Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Anyway, the Democratic Republicans eventually dropped the name Republican and called themselves Democrats. The National Republicans were to call themselves Whigs after 1828. Andrew Jackson had a few problems. He was a brawler, he was a dueler. He had killed at least 2 men in a duel, and also his marriage. He married a woman who had been married before, and then it was found out that somehow the divorce papers were not clear, or she did not have a clear divorce from her first husband. Well, Jackson quickly moved. I mean, Jackson had been a judge himself. He moved to get that situation straightened out, but it was too late. Again, the facts of it are not clear, but she was slandered, she was called an adulteress, and she became angry and bitter. Jackson took out his frustrations by dueling, but unfortunately for Jackson, the last man he dueled got his shot off and hit Jackson in the chest, and Jackson was to live in constant pain and suffer from lead poisoning from there on to the rest of his life. Jackson got his shot off and killed that man, but again, this was the last duel Jackson was to fight. Jackson was elected in November. He found out in December that he'd won the election, so he told his wife, let's prepare to go to Washington. Mrs. Jackson did not want to go to Washington at all, and she died of a heart attack in December before Jackson. So Jackson went to Washington alone. He was determined he was going to walk up the steps of the White House with his wife by his side. He walked up the steps of the White House alone. He appointed Martin Van Buren to be his Secretary of State, who became the next president. Because he didn't really like his official cabinet, he picked a bunch of his closest buddies, and these men became his unofficial supporters. They called him the kitchen cabinet. He used his veto more than all presidents before him combined had, and every veto he made was sustained. The other party never had enough votes to override his veto. Henry Clay got up a project to build a road between two cities in his home state. Jackson said the federal government has no business building roads between two cities in the same state, so Jackson vetoed it. Today, our presidents might do the same. Our federal highways today, every one of them, go through several states. I-75 starts up in Michigan and winds up down in Miami, Florida these days, but it took years to get that road finished. And I-95, the federal highway is usually a super highway that has no red lights, no stop signs, no crossroads, limited access. The roads that must cross either go above it or go down below it. Hopefully all of you know what I mean. Federal highways. Now, booming economy. Now, folk, what you're going to see, sad truth is, when you have a booming economy, it's always followed by a bust. So will the nation's economy ever go down again? I'm sure it will. When? I don't know. How far will it go when it goes down? I don't know. But it will go down. It always does. When it goes down, will it come back up? Probably. It always has. Just a fact of life. It reminds me, I know it's off the subject, but it reminds me of the climate. The climate gets hot, then we turn around and have an ice age. And then the climate gets hot again, and another ice age comes. This, folk, you can prove by studying paleontology, studying weather, prove as best as it can be proven. All right. The North established the first schools. The South established them only for white children. The girls began going to school also pretty early, and actually the girls were going to school before the colonial period ended. People wanted inexpensive teachers because taxpayers paid the teacher's wage. On a personal note, folk, I taught in a public school for 5.5 years. Then I got a job at Lockheed. And one of the men at Lockheed knew I'd been a teacher. Teachers should not make as much money as we do. We're the ones who make the money, and you guys don't. I didn't say a word. How many of you hope to be teachers? Anybody in here? Okay, well, congrats to you. I mean, I wish you well. I don't think the job can be done. But I'll quit. All right. The women who taught were usually in their teens and looked on teaching as a temporary job. But eventually, though, they realized maybe teachers ought to be trained, so they opened teacher training schools. Oberlin College in Ohio. I've got that written here. The first college to admit women in the 1830s. The school also admitted black males. I mean, it would admit women, black men, and of course white men. It did not admit black women. Again, folks, it was a school of its time period. You have to judge these people, these institutions, according to their own time period. People are not what they ought to be. I've already said that once. But the world is the way it is. You do try to make it better while you're on it. Try to make it better, but the world will hardly ever be a perfect place. Most pupils, when they finished school, went to work. A few went on to college. And of course, a lot of times, even in the 1830s, a young person would go to college, get out away from their families, and do things that their parents would try to tell them that they should not do. Anyway, more and more people were able to read dime novels, penny newspapers. What's a dime novel? Just what it says, it's a novel that cost a dime. That was a good bit of money when people were making. less than $1 a day. Some people making 70 and 80 cents a day, but they still could afford a dime novel, or a lot of them. Penny papers, a sheet of paper that had the news. Just one sheet of paper maybe had the news on front and back. Cost a penny. Acting, a lot of women took up acting. Before this, women had not been actors, but female acting had been frowned upon. Anyway, politicians and politicians and ministers began to hold crowds spellbound. And one of the biggest geniuses at political oration was Daniel Webster. There is a story going around that Daniel Webster once argued with the devil and won because of his political oratory. All right, we had a great awakening in the days of Jonathan Edwards, before the Revolutionary War, before the French and Indian War. About this time, there was a second great awakening. These revivals were very highly emotional, but they did have some practical and some of them lasting effect. Cane Hills, Kentucky is a place where the revival movement is said to have started. People would hold outdoor services. They'd basically get up in the morning, eat breakfast, go to a service in mid-morning, break up, eat lunch, then go to an afternoon service, break up again and eat an evening meal, then go to the evening service. And these services have a different preacher or special singers, preachers. Now, ministers insisted on the salvation right now. You don't have to wait. Now here is where the revival had a permanent effect. Up until this time, most of the Christians believed in predestination. That salvation was a matter of you either were or you weren't, and there was nothing to do about it. They had this same attitude when it came to society. Society is what it is and we can do nothing about it. Yes, we can do something about it. And anyway, Charles G. Finney was the leader in the Second Great Awakening. When the Erie Canal was completed, he began his preaching, and he believed one could lead a sinless life. This he got from preachers who had preached during the First Great Awakening. He used emotion, as did the others. But anyway, a lot of Americans began to pledge themselves to abstain from alcohol, to end prostitution. The use of alcohol was on the rise in the 1830s. John Adams had two sons. One of them, John Quincy Adams, became President of the United States. The other one became an alcoholic and died quite young. I had a student do a paper on alcohol consumption once. He said that it was something that everybody did without even thinking about the rightness or wrongness of it. But then came the 1830s, and there came factories, and there came railroads, and factory owners realized, hey, we must have sober workers coming into our factory. We can't let drunk people in. So the factory owners began to urge the churches, teach your members not to drink. Employers began to require temperance pledges from their employees. I promise if I'm hired here, I will not drink. Alcohol consumption decreased. Then came the Female Moral Reform Society, sought to end all forms of sexual irregularity, whether it be adultery, fornication, pornography, or any other form of what they called impropriety. Then they felt like, hey, we can improve society, let's get rid of slavery. There was a move to send slaves back to Africa, particularly a country in Africa called Liberia. Liberia is still a country, but these slaves, several of them were sent to Liberia. The strong ones began to copy what they'd had in the South. They began to build plantations and enslave the other ones. And they began to trade slaves back and forth, sell slaves from one plantation to another. In other words, they sold each other into slavery. This was Liberia, made up of former American slaves. Well, the Second Great Awakening called for slavery to end immediately. William Lloyd Garrison published a paper called The Liberator, in which he favored the end of slavery right now. Abolish slavery now. David Walker hinted that there should be violence against the white man if he did not change his racist ways. Garrison's and Walker's stories were banned in the South. Maria Stewart gave lectures against slavery, but she was a black woman. The fact that she was a woman created problems because most women were not allowed to speak in public. So she retired from public speaking, possibly because she was intimidated. But look, Garrison began to publish her lectures. Anti-slavery societies were organized in 1832 and 1833. Now, a lot of Northerners they didn't own slaves, but they feared that slavery was a threat to free labor. And they also were prejudiced against blacks. Now this is going to become important because here's what wound up happening in the 1960s when I was young. The race riots of the 60s started in the South, but then they hit the northern cities with even more furor than they did the southern cities. Particularly, I'm thinking about Detroit, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey, Toledo, Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, those places. What made people hate the Northerners so much was at least a Southern woman would admit, hey, I'm prejudiced. So you knew which side he was on. The Northern men pretended that they weren't prejudiced, but they really were. And you hate people like that, folk. But the Northerners were actually, in a lot of ways, more prejudiced, and the North was more segregated than the South. In the South, a lot of times, blacks and whites attended the same church together. In the North, not so. Northern churches had black churches and had white churches, and they were segregated and separated. The anti-slavery movement in the North got a lot of riots started in the North, and this was even in the 1830s, not necessarily just in the 1960s. White women spoke against slavery. Their parents had been slave owners, but they turned against it. Again, the fact that they were women kept their message from being heard. Abolition in the 1830s divided the country as no other issue ever had. Now, beginning in the 1830s and continuing through the 1840s and 1850s, the nation began, each side became more and more polarized, with the anti-slave people becoming more anti-slave and the pro-slave people becoming more pro-slave. This, of course, I think all of you know, was to lead to a civil war. Dual message from evangelicals. Salvation was for everybody. You don't have to be predestined. And society needed to be perfected. Now, one thing I don't mention here, but other history books have, out of the Second Great Awakening came several colleges. You might know that Vanderbilt, maybe you don't know, was once a Christian college. All your Ivy League schools, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, started out as Christian colleges and started out for the purpose to train preachers. Eventually, a lot of these the churches lost a lot of these colleges, though. All right. Jackson basically defined the Democratic Party. He favored, again, opportunity for all white men. I mean, I have to say that, folks. The book does. It's simply a fact of life. He favored westward expansion and a strong president. Harry Truman said, one reason I'm a Democrat is because the Democrats have had strong presidents. The Republicans have not, and there was a lot of truth in that. Even though the Republicans did not believe that the president should be strong, the strength of the party lay in the people, not the presidency. All right, Andrew Jackson. Were Indians citizens? or were they a separate nation? Before Jackson's time, some of the presidents had tried to civilize the Indians. Jackson said this is absurd, they can't be civilized. The Indians would never assimilate into white society. Congress had tried to convert the Indians to Christianity and educate them, and folks, this attempt was still going on when I was in college. Well, Indian women, in Indian society, women were considered equal to men. In Christian society, women were supposed to be subject to their husbands. And Indian women found that they felt like they were lower than they were in Indian society. So Indian women generally did not accept Christianity, and of course that meant the men didn't either. Again, folk, in any religion, it's the women who pass it down from one generation to the next. And when you lose your women, you've lost your religion. And one of the things, now I'm jumping around it, but I'll say this, Islam fears that if they lose their women, the whole religion will die. And if the Islamic women adopt Western women's ways of having their own jobs, having their own car, being able to divorce their husbands, dressing like Western women dress, Islam men fear that they will lose. And that's not an unfounded fear either. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, in which the government was to pay for the removal of Indian tribes westward. You might wonder, why was this necessary? Well, now, my wife had all members of her family killed except for 4 boys, one of them her great-grandfather. They were living in Waycross, and some Indians attacked them and burnt her house down, killed the father and mother, the baby, all the women, and the visitors. But 4 boys went through the thickets and escaped and went to the militia and told the militia. So the militia came out, too late to save anybody, and the militia drove them deep into Florida. Now, 2 types of Indian. Well, there is a Cherokee. The Cherokee nation almost assimilated. A Cherokee chief named Sequoyah invented an alphabet, civilized himself, and folk, here's a picture of Sequoyah showing off his writing, showing off his alphabet. The alphabet was written, of course, in his native tongue. And if you ever go to Calhoun, Calhoun was the capital of the Cherokee nation, and they built a nation inside the United States where they could be like themselves. And also in Spring Place was the Chief Van House, a 2-story large brick house built by an Indian named Van, Chief Van. They were assimilated, but it wasn't enough. The United States decided to drive them out. The Indians took their case to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the court ruled that they could become an independent nation and stay put. Andrew Jackson said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. I'll have nothing to do with it. We're going to drive them out in spite of what the court said. He's the only president in history who has actually done that. Today's presidents are afraid to do that. Well, Franklin Roosevelt tried to take on the court and he lost. And no president from that day to this has stood up to our courts. It's 2 years, nothing happened. But then a small group of Cherokees signed away some land to the state of Georgia. Georgia sold the land to whites, so whites moved into what was to be Indian territory. And at that point, Jackson moved them. Let's see. Now, weirdly enough, and folk, I can't answer this. The removal began here in North Georgia. And it involved eastern North Carolina and southeast Tennessee. So this area here